They say a soldier never truly stops serving. Even after the uniforms are folded, the medals tucked away, and the war stories fade into silence, some carry the mission forward in quieter ways. Samuel Bell was one of them. Most people in his neighborhood knew him simply as Mr. Bell, a soft-spoken older gentleman with an old army cap, a white cane, and a black Labrador named Guide, who never left his side. What they didn't know was the journey that brought him to that corner of Elm and Third, or the storm that was about to be unleashed by what happened there. Sam had lost his sight nearly 40 years ago, not to enemy fire, but to a microscopic enemy, an infection contracted while stationed in a mosquito-infested jungle halfway across the world. His was the kind of service most people never hear about. There were no headlines, no victory parades, just a brutal deployment in a forgotten conflict and a discharge with a diagnosis no one could fix. But Sam adapted. The military had drilled discipline into him. Life had taught him resilience. Over the decades, he built a life in the dark, guided by sound, smell, memory, and by a series of expertly trained service dogs, the latest being Guide, who had been his eyes for the last 8 years. Every Thursday, Sam made the same walk, down Maple Avenue, past the corner bakery, across Elm and Third, and over to the public library. He volunteered reading to children. Well, he listened to children read to him. It gave them confidence, and it gave him purpose. That day, like every other, he left his apartment exactly at 9:15, cane in one hand, Guide's harness in the other, the cool morning breeze tugging at his coat. The intersection of Elm and Third was always tricky. Impatient drivers, short walk signals, and honking horns made it nerve-wracking even for those with perfect vision. But Sam had mastered it. He always waited for the chirping audio cue that signaled it was safe to walk, and when he heard it, he gave Guide a firm but gentle command, "Forward." Together they stepped off the curb. Unbeknownst to Sam, less than 50 feet away, 2 young patrol officers sat in their cruiser sipping lukewarm coffee. They had parked around the corner, out of view of most of the intersection, killing time, bored, maybe even hoping something, anything, would break up the monotony of another uneventful morning shift. When they saw Sam and Guide begin crossing, they didn't see the white cane. They didn't notice the bright blue service dog vest. They didn't hear the chirping pedestrian signal or notice the calm, deliberate pace of a blind man moving with practiced care. What they saw was an elderly man moving slowly through a crosswalk as the light prepared to change and traffic started to bunch up. "Look at this guy," one muttered, already annoyed. "Taking his sweet time, gonna cause a pile-up." "Probably high or senile," the other added without hesitation, chuckling at his own comment. Neither of them paused to consider that there might be more to the situation. Neither took a moment to step out, approach, or observe. They saw a delay, a disruption, and they reached for the tools they'd been given to enforce compliance. One of them flicked on the siren, a short, piercing blast meant to jolt attention. The other hit the PA system. "Hey, you in the crosswalk, move it, lights changing." The voice exploded from an unexpected angle, reverberating through the intersection. For Sam, it was as though the ground shifted. His world operated on routine and predictability. Sound was everything. That sudden burst of mechanical noise disoriented him immediately. Guide stopped. Sam stopped. He tilted his head, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it was distorted, impersonal, angry. The kind of voice that came with confrontation, not help. And now the traffic light had shifted. Cars began creeping forward. Horns honked. The symphony of urban chaos crescendoed, and at its center stood a blind veteran, frozen, trying desperately to make sense of it all. He tapped his cane more quickly, trying to gauge his position. He turned slightly, trying to listen for a familiar cue. Guide was confused too, ears back, uncertain whether to move forward or retreat. Sam's heart pounded. "I'm trying," he called out, his voice tight with panic. "I'm blind." But his words were lost in the rising din. The officers didn't step out. They didn't reassess. One leaned into the PA system again and shouted, "Are you deaf too? Move!" To them, it was a routine clearance of a pedestrian they saw as non-compliant. To Sam, it was the moment his entire reality was upended. And in the next 60 seconds, that misjudgment, rooted in arrogance, inattention, and a complete lack of empathy, would ignite a chain reaction that neither officer could have imagined. Cars at the intersection began creeping forward one by one, inching closer to Sam as he stood motionless, uncertain of which direction was safe. The honks came louder now, insistent, sharp, almost hostile. Some drivers swerved into the opposing lane to avoid him. Others yelled through their windows. No one stepped out to help. No one paused to ask why an elderly man with a cane and a service dog was standing still in a crosswalk with visible panic on his face. He was no longer a person to them, just an obstacle in their path. And still, the officers stayed in their cruiser, watching. The loudspeaker crackled again. "This is your final warning. Get out of the road now." The volume was deafening. Sam couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. It bounced off buildings, warped by the acoustics of the city. His training, his years of navigating through darkness, were all rooted in routine. Familiar sounds, steady patterns, predictable responses. But this wasn't routine. This was chaos, and chaos was dangerous. Guide whined and circled back towards Sam, pulling gently at the harness, unsure whether to retreat to the curb or continue forward. Her body was tense. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Sam could feel her trembling beneath his hand. He tried to focus, tried to calm his racing heart, but the noise was everywhere, shouting, honking, engines revving, and no one offering clarity. He took one cautious step, then another. His cane struck the edge of the curb, then slipped off again. He was disoriented, trapped in a storm of confusion. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Please, I just need a moment." Inside the patrol car, one of the officers reached for his radio. "Got a subject obstructing traffic, male, elderly, not responding to commands, might be under the influence, possible mental episode." It wasn't a lie in his mind. It was easier to believe the man in the crosswalk was belligerent than to entertain the idea that he might simply need help, that he might be someone who had already given more to his country than most people could fathom. The other officer had already made his decision. Adrenaline surged, a mixture of frustration, impatience, and the distorted belief that he was taking control of a situation. He threw open the cruiser door, stepped out onto the street and drew his taser. People on the sidewalk turned their heads, someone fumbled for a phone, but before anyone could move or speak or understand what was happening, the officer was already shouting, "Sir, you've been warned. Step to the sidewalk now." Sam, who still couldn't locate the source of the noise, turned his head blindly toward the voice. "I'm blind," he called out again, more desperately this time. "I can't see you." It didn't matter. The officer saw hesitation. He saw movement that didn't match the command. He interpreted it as resistance. In truth, Sam was trying to comply. His world was nothing but voices and echoes now. But to the officer, it looked like defiance. The taser clicked. Two thin wires flew through the air and lodged into Sam's back with a dull pop. The electricity surged through him in an instant. His muscles clenched violently. A scream tore from his throat, raw, animal, involuntary. His knees buckled. His cane flew from his hand, clattering against the pavement and disappearing beneath a car. Guide let out a sharp, terrified bark as Sam collapsed into the middle of the road. The impact of his body hitting the pavement was sickening. His arm twisted beneath him. His head struck the painted lines of the crosswalk. Guide rushed to him, barking furiously now, pawing at his chest, trying to rouse him. She didn't understand why her partner had fallen, only that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. Her training told her to stay close, to protect, to alert. The officer didn't pause. He ran forward and dropped to his knees beside Sam, not to help, but to handcuff him. His hands grabbed Sam's wrists and yanked them behind his back. Sam was still twitching from the aftershock of the taser, groaning in pain, trying to lift his head. "Why?" he gasped, his words slurred. "I didn't do anything." Another voice shouted from the sidewalk. "He's blind! What the hell are you doing? He's got a service dog!" A crowd was forming. Phones were out. Someone screamed. Others just stood in stunned silence. But the damage had already been done. Sam Bell, war veteran, volunteer, neighbor, mentor, was lying stunned and handcuffed in the middle of a crosswalk, his service dog barking in panic, his body spasming involuntarily, and two officers still oblivious to the catastrophic mistake they had just made. The intersection, usually buzzing with the impatient rhythms of city life, had frozen. For a moment, time didn't seem to move. Sam Bell lay crumpled in the crosswalk, handcuffed, dazed, his face pressed against cold asphalt that smelled faintly of rubber and oil. His service dog, Guide, barked and whimpered beside him, nudging his shoulder, licking his cheek, trying everything she knew to wake her person up. A woman on the corner gasped, one hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the white cane that now lay abandoned under a parked car. Another man, older and wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, muttered a curse under his breath, then stepped off the curb, only to be stopped by a young officer who barked at him to stay back. The man didn't. He stayed just close enough to see clearly, just close enough to remember this moment. Across the street, a child asked their mother why the man with the dog was on the ground. The mother didn't answer. The air was thick now, not with noise, but with disbelief. The uniformed officer, still kneeling beside Sam, looked up and around for the first time and realized that people were watching, dozens of them. And they weren't confused. They were angry. One woman shouted, "He's blind! What's wrong with you?" Her voice cut through the moment like a siren. Another joined her. "He didn't do anything, that's a service dog." And then a third. "You can't just taser an old man in the middle of the street." Still, the officer at Sam's side seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to argue or follow through. His partner stood off to the side, pale now, gripping the radio but no longer speaking into it. The world had tilted underneath them, and for the first time they realized they might have gone too far. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, getting closer fast, but even louder was the chorus of protest building around the intersection. Bystanders weren't just angry, they were documenting, calling, reporting. A nearby cafe had emptied out. A bus had stopped. What had started as a moment of misunderstanding had exploded into a public spectacle, and not the kind of spectacle the department would want on the evening news. Within minutes, a second police vehicle pulled up, lights spinning silently. From the driver's side stepped a seasoned officer, Sergeant Karen Kelly, 24 years on the force, and not one to take nonsense lightly. She walked straight to the two young officers, her face unreadable but her jaw tight. She didn't need to ask what happened. The image in front of her spoke volumes. An elderly man in restraints, a service dog in distress, a crowd ready to explode. "Remove the cuffs," she said, voice low but firm. The officer hesitated. He was resisting. "Now," she said, cutting him off. The cuffs came off. Paramedics rushed in, one taking Sam's vitals, the other checking for injuries, speaking gently to try and ground him in the present. He was semi-conscious, blinking slowly, murmuring words that made no sense. Shock was setting in. His body, already fragile from age, was reacting to trauma it couldn't process. Sergeant Kelly turned her attention to the officers. "What exactly were you thinking?" she demanded. The younger one stammered something about obstruction and refusal to comply. "He's blind," she said flatly. "You didn't see the cane, the dog? You didn't bother to walk 10 feet and check before you lit him up in the middle of traffic?" No answer. There wasn't one good enough. And yet, even in that moment, they had no idea what was coming next. Unbeknownst to them, a retired army colonel had been sitting by the cafe window the entire time. He hadn't said a word while the chaos unfolded. He'd watched, recognized Sam instantly, and made one phone call, short, direct, to a number not many civilians knew. It didn't go to local law enforcement. It didn't route through City Hall. It connected to a secure line at a nearby military base, a liaison desk designed for only the most serious internal matters. His voice had been calm when he spoke. "We have a problem," he said. "It's Sam Bell. He's been tased. Public incident. Civilian police." The voice on the other end didn't ask questions, just said, "Understood," and hung up. Exactly 7 minutes later, before the paramedics had even lifted Sam onto the stretcher, something unusual happened. The sirens had faded. The crowd murmured. Then a new sound rolled in, low, heavy, mechanical. It wasn't an ambulance. It wasn't another police cruiser. It was deeper, almost guttural. The sound of military-grade diesel engines drawing closer, shaking the air in their wake. The first vehicle came into view from the east. A Humvee, olive drab, government plates, no hesitation. It didn't slow for the police perimeter. It drove through it. Startled officers stumbled out of the way as it maneuvered itself sideways to block off traffic from one direction. Within seconds, another Humvee appeared from the opposite side. Then a third vehicle, larger, meaner, an LMTV troop carrier, pulled across the intersection, cutting off the final approach. In less than a minute, Elm and 3rd had transformed from an urban crossing to a secured perimeter. The soldiers who stepped out weren't here to threaten or posture. They didn't raise weapons or issue commands. They moved with calm purpose. Each of them took a position, not aggressive, but firm, present, undeniable. Their faces were composed, unreadable. They didn't need to say anything. Their uniforms said it for them. This wasn't about dominance. This was about protection. And in the center of it all, lying weak and bruised in the crosswalk, was Sam Bell, one of their own. The military presence was like nothing the city had ever seen in peacetime. Civilians on the sidewalks stood still, phones gripped in their hands but no longer raised. Even the traffic that had been honking moments ago had gone dead silent, the engines idling, drivers wide-eyed, unsure if what they were seeing was real. What had started as a confusing encounter in a crosswalk had escalated into something monumental. A Humvee now sat parked diagonally across one lane, blocking entry to the intersection with the same finality as a steel door slamming shut. Another positioned itself directly opposite, cutting off exit. The troop carrier, a hulking, boxy LMTV, sealed the 3rd approach. The 4th remained open, just wide enough for emergency vehicles to operate, but flanked by 2 uniformed soldiers standing silently, eyes scanning every person and vehicle with calm vigilance. The soldiers weren't from the National Guard. These weren't weekend reservists pulled in for crowd control. These were active duty personnel from a regional command post less than 10 miles away. Combat trained, federally authorized, and unmistakably serious. Their presence didn't just carry weight, it carried intent. Every step they took, every movement they made, projected one message. Someone crossed a line, and we are here to make it known. Sergeant Kelly, still kneeling beside the paramedics tending to Sam, stood slowly, her eyes narrowing as the vehicles locked the area down. She reached for her shoulder mic, speaking quietly into it, alerting dispatch that there were now multiple military assets on site and requesting clarification on their presence. The response came back jumbled, confused. No one on the city side had authorized this. No call had been routed through proper civilian command. These units hadn't been deployed, they had responded, directly, deliberately, with purpose. Then the rear doors of the lead Humvee swung open. Out stepped a tall man with a chest full of ribbons and stars that seemed to reflect the morning light. The uniform was pristine, the posture unmistakable. This wasn't some mid-level liaison sent to gather facts. This was General Michael Vance, commander of the Regional Army Forces, a 4-star whose name was known throughout the ranks not just for his operational record, but for his loyalty, unflinching, uncompromising, to those who had worn the uniform before. He didn't need an entourage to establish presence, though a pair of aides trailed behind him, struggling to match his long, determined strides. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on one thing, the stretcher being lifted gently into the back of the ambulance. He walked past the officers as if they weren't there, past the police supervisor, past the civilians lining the sidewalks, straight toward the cluster of paramedics and the shaking black Labrador standing guard beside the man they were tending. Guide looked up first. Her tail wagged feebly, a mix of instinct and confusion. The general slowed as he approached her, his hard expression softening for the briefest moment. He knelt, ran a hand over her head, then stood and faced the stretcher. Sam was pale, his shirt torn, electrodes still clinging to his chest. His breathing was shallow, his eyes, still unseeing, blinked slowly. The world was muffled to him now, sirens, voices, vibrations of motion around him. But something about the general's voice cut through. "Sergeant Samuel Bell," the general said, low but firm, with the unmistakable cadence of someone trained to command respect. Sam turned his head slightly, his lips parting. "Vance," he rasped. "I'm here, Sam. Don't speak, just rest. We've got it now." The general placed a hand on the stretcher rail, holding it there for a moment like a promise made tangible. "You're safe. We're with you." The medics nodded, closing the doors behind him with deliberate care. The ambulance pulled away slowly, not racing but steady, with soldiers clearing its path. And when it disappeared down the block, General Vance turned, this time toward the uniformed officers still standing like statues, unsure whether to flee or salute. His gaze landed on Officer Miller first, then Davis, scanning them like dossiers he didn't need to read twice. "Which one of you fired?" Miller swallowed hard. I did, sir. He wasn't responding to commands. We feared for... You feared what? That an elderly man with a white cane and a guide dog would cause a riot? No, sir. We were concerned about... Were you concerned about your training? About whether you were competent enough to distinguish between a threat and a blind man? Because that's what this is. Not a misunderstanding. Not a difficult situation. This is incompetence and cowardice. Officer Davis opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. His face had gone pale. Sergeant Kelly stepped forward then, voice quiet. Sir, I've already called it into Internal Affairs. I've initiated preliminary statements and... There will be 2 investigations, General Vance said, cutting her off without raising his voice. Yours and mine. I've already contacted the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They'll be here within the hour. I suggest you make yourself available. He turned his gaze once more toward the intersection. The crowd had not dispersed. No one was chanting, no one was yelling. But every eye was locked on him. Every phone was still recording. Because everyone there understood the weight of what had just occurred. A line had been crossed, and someone with real authority had actually shown up to do something about it. The general turned to one of his aides and said simply, Call the mayor, call the chief, tell them I'll be waiting at City General, 1 hour. Then without another word, he walked back to the edge of the intersection, where Guide was still being gently held by one of the paramedics. He knelt again, placing both hands on either side of the dog's face. You did good, girl, real good, he murmured. He's going to be okay. We've got him now. And with that, the street, the silence, the pressure, all of it shifted. This wasn't just a show of force, it was a promise, a message sent with absolute clarity. One of ours was harmed, and we do not abandon our own. Not now, not ever. The officers stood frozen, their uniforms suddenly feeling much heavier under the weight of what they'd just been a part of. Their authority, once amplified through a badge, a vehicle, and a voice on a speaker, now seemed paper-thin under the gaze of a 4-star general and the silent, watchful presence of soldiers trained to operate in real conflict zones. General Vance turned slowly, scanning their faces, not with rage, but with something colder, measured disappointment. Not the kind that passes with time, but the kind that lingers, the kind that follows someone for the rest of their career, if not their life. You tased a 78-year-old man, Vance said quietly. Blind, alone, in the middle of a crosswalk, with a white cane in one hand and a service animal in the other. What possible threat did you think he posed? What risk justified that decision? Neither officer responded. The words had already been said, their actions already recorded. The silence that followed was damning enough. You didn't see a veteran. You didn't even see a person. You saw a delay. You saw inconvenience. So you reached for force instead of reason, aggression instead of understanding. Vance stepped closer, his voice never rising but gaining gravity with every word. Sergeant Samuel Bell lost his sight serving a country that didn't even remember the war he fought in. He came home quietly, without complaint, without anger, and for decades he adapted. He served his community, mentored children, walked the same route every week with the same dog by his side. Until today. Today, you made him feel like a criminal for simply trying to cross a street, and for that, you will answer. Sergeant Kelly, watching from a few steps back, said nothing. She knew the investigation was no longer in her hands alone. The weight of federal oversight had arrived, and it wasn't leaving any time soon. Vance turned back to his aide and repeated the order. I want the mayor. I want the chief of police, at City General. 1 hour. As he walked past the officers for the last time, he didn't spare them another glance. They no longer mattered in that moment. What mattered was the man being wheeled through the doors of the hospital across town, the man whose path had been shattered by ignorance and arrogance, and who now lay recovering in a hospital bed under the watch of physicians, nurses, and a city scrambling to make sense of its failure. By the time General Vance arrived at the hospital, the mayor and police chief were already waiting. They had come quickly, grim-faced and rattled, flanked by press aides who were frantically coordinating statements behind the scenes. The general didn't ask for excuses. He didn't want apologies. What he demanded was action. Inside a private consultation room near the ER wing, he outlined the expectations in terms that left no room for negotiation. Immediate suspension of the involved officers without pay, a full public apology from the department, and the establishment of new training protocols for every single officer in the city. Training that would emphasize de-escalation, disability awareness, and most importantly, respect. Not courtesy, not just procedure, but actual lived empathetic respect for those who navigate the world differently. The police chief, a man with decades on the force, nodded heavily. He knew there was no spinning this. The footage was already circulating online, millions of views and counting. Every angle of the encounter had been captured, from the moment the PA system barked its first order to the moment Sam collapsed with Guide barking beside him. The public wasn't waiting for a press release. They were demanding justice. And they got it. The city fast-tracked new training requirements. Officers Miller and Davis were placed on indefinite unpaid suspension, pending the results of both internal and federal investigations. The department issued a rare public acknowledgement of fault, naming Sam Bell specifically and pledging to overhaul the way their officers interacted with individuals with disabilities, especially veterans. At City General, Sam was slowly recovering. His body ached, bruises blooming across his back and ribs, his muscles still sore from the taser's charge. But the physical pain wasn't the worst of it. The betrayal, the sudden fear, the sense of powerlessness, that had cut far deeper. He had survived combat, infection, blindness, and decades of navigating a world not built for people like him. But nothing prepared him for being treated like a threat for doing the same thing he'd done every week for years. And yet, he wasn't alone. Veterans groups flooded the hospital with letters, flowers, calls, and offers of support. Guide was checked by a military veterinarian and stayed by Sam's bedside throughout. Volunteers arrived daily, some to read to him, others just to sit and talk. And every day someone in uniform passed through, not out of obligation, but because they understood something that couldn't be taught in a police academy. That loyalty doesn't end with service. The general visited more than once. On one visit, as Sam lay resting, he sat beside him in silence for a long time. Then finally he said, "You were left in the dark for us, Sam. It's our job now to make sure no one lets that happen again. You're not invisible, you're not forgotten, and this city just got a very loud reminder of what happens when they treat our own like strangers." Sam nodded faintly, emotion catching in his throat. "Didn't expect all this," he said, voice raspy. "You shouldn't have had to," Vance replied, "but sometimes the world needs a wake-up call. And sometimes that call comes from the sound of boots hitting pavement to protect a man who already gave more than anyone ever asked." In the weeks that followed, the city changed. Not completely, not instantly, but visibly. Crosswalk signals were upgraded. Accessibility programs received new funding. Officers underwent updated training. But more than policy, it was the image that endured. A blind veteran on the pavement, surrounded by silence, only to be answered by the sudden, unshakable presence of those who remembered what it meant to protect. Because when you hurt someone who stood between danger and this country, someone who gave up their sight so others wouldn't have to, you invite more than criticism. You invite the return of those who still remember the oath they took. And sometimes they return not with force, but with conviction, with unity, and with the quiet thunder of boots on pavement making one thing clear: we take care of our own.